After my brother's death, he left everything to me. A vast estate, a Rolls-Royce, and $500 million from the sale of his company. And then, after 20 years of silence, my 2 children suddenly called me. And once again I heard the word Mom. I often think about my brother when the evenings grow quiet. The world knew him as a titan of business. A man who turned oil fields into empires and boardrooms into battlefields. But to me he was just Thomas, my baby brother with the mischievous smile and the stubborn streak that could move mountains. We grew up with very little. A 2-room farmhouse in Oklahoma. The kind where winters rattled the windows and summers baked the roof shingles until they curled like pie crust. Our father worked himself raw in the fields, and Mama stretched $1 thinner than tissue paper. But Thomas, he had a fire in him. I remember he used to sit out on the porch sketching machines in the dirt with a stick. Big rigs, pumps, things none of us could even imagine owning. Someday, he'd tell me, his voice still that of a boy, I'm gonna build something so big, people will come from all over just to see it. And Lord, he wasn't wrong. He started small. In his 20s, he scraped enough money together to buy a couple of used rigs. The banks laughed at him, told him oil was for the giants, not for a skinny farm boy with dirt under his fingernails. But Thomas didn't scare easy. He worked the fields himself, sun up to sundown, coming home with oil on his clothes and grit in his eyes. He wasn't just digging wells, he was digging his way out of the life we'd known. One success led to another. By the time he was 35, he owned an oil company with his name stamped on every contract. Not inherited, not bought with family money, built with his own hands, his sweat, his refusal to quit. Folks used to call him the last cowboy of oil, because while others played games in polished offices, Thomas never forgot the land. He'd walk his sites in dusty boots, shake every worker's hand, and eat the same bologna sandwiches they did. He never married. Not once. Said the company was his bride and the rigs his children. Oh, there were women who tried, believe me. He was handsome, tall, with that kind of presence that filled a room before he even spoke. But he always said he had no time for a family. Maybe deep down he just knew his road was meant to be walked alone. I used to worry about him living that way. No one to come home to, no one to fuss over him when the world grew heavy. But Thomas always brushed me off, saying, "Don't you fret, sis. You've got enough worrying for the both of us." And then, almost as quickly as he had built it, he sold it all. $500 million. Can you imagine? A poor farm boy from Oklahoma, cashing out at $500 million. He told me once he wanted to leave the game on his own terms. Better to walk away standing tall than be carried out when the well runs dry, he said. That was Thomas, always 10 steps ahead. But behind the headlines, behind the numbers and the handshakes, he was still my brother. The boy who used to sneak me extra biscuits at supper. The man who called me every Sunday, no matter where in the world he was. When he passed, I felt something inside me hollow out. He left no children, no wife, no one but me. And in that absence, he did something I still can't quite wrap my head around. He left it all to me. Not just the money, though Lord knows that was staggering enough, but his world. His sprawling estate in Los Angeles. A place so large I got lost twice just walking from the library to the kitchen. His cars, his art, his wine cellar, though I never cared much for that. And most tenderly of all, his Rolls-Royce. A silver beauty he polished himself every Saturday morning. He used to call it his companion, and he never let anyone else drive it. The lawyers looked at me like I was a curiosity when they read the will. A widow in her 70s, hair silvering, hands worn from years of homemaking and heartbreak. What was I supposed to do with $500 million? They didn't understand. They didn't know what it meant, after a lifetime of being overlooked, to be trusted so completely. When I signed the papers, I felt Thomas with me. As if he'd reached across from wherever he is now and placed all that weight into my hands, saying, "Here, sis. I built this for you." And maybe he did. The world saw Thomas as a giant, a mogul, a legend. I saw him as my brother. And now, somehow, I am the keeper of his legacy. I don't kid myself, it isn't just wealth. It's responsibility. To honor the life he lived, the grit he carried, the empire he forged out of nothing but red dirt and dreams. And as I stood in that lawyer's office, the ink still drying on the documents that made me the heir to his fortune, I whispered a promise to him. I won't let you down, Thomas. Because he never let me down, not once. The first time I turned the key to my brother's Los Angeles estate, I swear my knees almost gave out. The door alone must have been 12 feet high, carved oak with brass handles polished so bright you could see your face in them. When it swung open, a hush fell over me, like I had stepped into a cathedral instead of a home. The air inside smelled faintly of leather and old wood, with a hint of cigar smoke clinging to the walls. My brother never smoked much, but when he did, he made a ceremony of it, lighting one of those fat cigars on the porch while the sun sank low, as if he was sealing a deal with the sky itself. That scent had soaked into the curtains, the rugs, the chairs. It was him everywhere. I set my suitcase down in the grand foyer, and the wheels clicked loudly against the marble tile. My own footsteps echoed back at me, hollow, like the house was asking who I thought I was, barging in with my thrift store suitcase and scuffed shoes. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of a life I had only glimpsed from afar. A sweeping staircase curled up to the second floor, draped in a runner so plush my feet sank with each step. The walls were lined with paintings, real paintings, the kind you see in museums, not the framed prints from Sears I had hung in my old house. In the living room, bookshelves climbed the walls like trees, their spines stamped in gold, names of authors I barely recognized. A globe the size of a barrel stood in the corner, the kind you see in old adventure movies, with places I had only ever read about. I wandered from room to room, opening doors like a child on Christmas morning. A library with leather armchairs and a fireplace big enough to stand inside. A dining room with a table so long I wondered if he ever sat at one end and felt lonely staring across all that polished wood. A kitchen gleaming with copper pots and marble counters, so different from my little formica-top table where I used to knead bread while the kids squabbled in the next room. Upstairs, the bedrooms were each a world of their own. His master suite overlooked the city lights, curtains heavy enough to block out the sun. The closet was the size of my entire living room back home, lined with suits, ties, and shoes in neat rows like soldiers waiting for orders. I paused in front of his bed, the sheets still pulled tight, the pillows dented faintly where his head must have rested. I pressed my hand against the quilt and whispered, "Thomas, what am I doing here?" Because as grand as it all was, I felt like an imposter. This wasn't my world. I had lived most of my life in modest homes where the creak of the floorboards and the smell of Sunday roast were the only luxuries. I had raised children in spaces where every inch mattered, where laundry hung on the line and pennies had to be stretched. This estate, this mansion, it felt like walking into someone else's dream. The servants had been dismissed after his passing. He left me the choice to rehire, but I didn't want strangers bustling about. So it was just me and the silence. Silence that pressed in from every corner, filling the high ceilings and long hallways until it felt like it might swallow me whole. At night I would sit in his study, the city glowing beyond the windows, and imagine him sitting where I was, pen in hand, drawing up contracts that would change lives. I'd run my fingers along the grooves of his desk, worn smooth where his hands had rested thousands of times. The leather chair smelled faintly of cologne, sharp, clean, expensive. I would close my eyes and almost hear his voice, steady and sure, as though he might walk in at any moment. The Rolls-Royce sat in the garage, polished to perfection. I'd never driven it, not then. I'd only stand there, staring at the silver hood ornament catching the light, remembering how proud he was of it. "She purrs like a cat," he once told me, patting the steering wheel with a grin. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Not yet. Loneliness crept into the corners. A house that large with so many rooms has a way of making a person feel small. I found myself talking out loud just to hear another voice, even if it was my own. Some nights I left the radio playing softly in the kitchen, letting old country songs keep me company as I drifted from room to room, trying to get used to the echo of my own life in this vast place. But alongside the loneliness came something else, a quiet reverence. I was living in the house my brother had built with his hands, his grit, his brilliance. Every polished floorboard, every chandelier, every stone in the garden was a reminder of him. And though it wasn't my world, he had given it to me. Not the neighbors, not the bankers, not my children, me. And so I tried to make peace with it. I set out a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, though it looked pitiful in the vast space. I unpacked my old quilt and draped it over one of the leather chairs, the colors almost laughable against the dark mahogany, but it comforted me. I brewed tea in the marble kitchen and carried the chipped mug I'd brought from home, sipping slowly as if daring the house to scold me for not pouring it into fine china. In those first days I learned something important. A house, no matter how grand, is just walls and floors until you breathe into it. And though I was trembling inside, unsure if I belonged, I told myself, Thomas wanted me here. And that is enough. The mansion was so still that sometimes I swore I could hear the hum of my own heart. Days stretched long, each one measured by little routines I created to keep from losing myself. Morning tea in the sunroom, a slow walk through the rose garden, evenings spent in the library with one of Thomas's heavy books propped against my lap. It was on one of those evenings, when the sun had dipped low and the sky was painted orange, that the silence broke. The phone rang. I startled so hard I nearly spilled my tea. Hardly anyone called me directly anymore. Most people sent letters or emails, or in the case of my old friends, postcards with a scribbled "thinking of you." My brother used to call every Sunday like clockwork, but he was gone now. So when the phone rang, echoing through that cavern of a house, I hurried to it with a strange mix of hope and dread. Hello. My voice sounded small in all that empty space. There was a pause, then a syrupy voice. Mom? It's us. My knees locked. I hadn't heard that word, Mom, spoken with such practiced sweetness in 20 years. For a moment I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight, as if it remembered what they had done before my mind even caught up. Oh, Mom, my daughter chimed in, her tone sugary and bright. We haven't seen you for so long. We thought we'd come visit. Isn't that wonderful? Wonderful. That's what she called it. My hand gripped the receiver so tightly my knuckles ached. The memories came rushing back, sharp as glass. The night they turned on me after their father's funeral, the way their voices hardened when they told me I had no place in the home anymore. How they divided our little house into two halves like they were slicing a loaf of bread. My son's family in one side, my daughter's in the other. And me? They left me with nothing. Not even a room to call my own. They hadn't asked where I would go. They hadn't cared. After decades of marriage, of raising them in that very house, I was shown the door like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I had wandered then, stunned, grieving not only for my husband but for the children who had once clung to my skirts. I remember the weight of the suitcase handle biting into my palm as I walked away from the house I had poured my life into. Their father had trusted them so blindly. He left everything to them, never imagining they would turn me out. And they rewarded his trust by erasing me. And now here they were, my children. Their voices dripping with honey. Mom? My son said, coaxing as if he feared I might hang up. We really want to see you. It's been too long. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself. I could almost hear Thomas's voice in my ear. They will come when they smell money. Be ready. What brought this on? I asked quietly. Oh, nothing, my daughter hurried to say. We just miss you. Don't we, Greg? Of course, he agreed too quickly. It's family, Mom. We should be together. We've been talking, and we all decided we'd love to come see your new place. Your new place. That was how he said it, as if the words tasted strange in his mouth, as if it should have been their place all along. The estate. The money. The Rolls-Royce. They knew. Of course they knew. News like that travels fast. Faster than compassion. Faster than genuine affection. I felt my spine stiffen. For 20 years I had lived with the ache of their betrayal. For 20 years I had been the unwanted mother, the castaway. And now suddenly I was worth a visit. I thought of the silence of the house, the weight of its grandeur pressing down on me. Yes, it was lonely, but at least it was honest. This house made no pretense of love. My children, on the other hand, wanted to dress their greed in the costume of care. Still, I didn't say no. Not yet. Some battles you don't rush into. You let them show their hand first. Well, I said slowly, if you'd like to come, I suppose that would be fine. Their delight was quick, too quick. My daughter clapped her hands, at least I imagine she did from the burst of cheer in her voice. My son's relief spilled out like he had been holding his breath. Wonderful, Mom. We'll make arrangements. Don't worry about a thing. We'll take care of everything. The call ended with promises of hugs and laughter, of family dinners and catching up. But when I set the phone down, my hand trembled. Not from joy, not from excitement. From the chill of knowing exactly what they were after. I stood there a long while in the grand foyer, the chandelier glittering above me, and whispered into the silence, "They're coming, Thomas. Just like you said they would." And in that moment I swore to myself, this time they would not take everything from me. When I set the phone back on its cradle that evening, I just stood there in the stillness of the mansion. The chandelier above me glittered as though it were mocking me. My children were coming, children who hadn't so much as sent me a birthday card in 2 decades. And suddenly the ghosts of that old betrayal stirred inside me, raw and fresh as though it had happened yesterday. I can still see it as clear as the lines on my hands. The night of their father's funeral, the house thick with the smell of lilies and coffee. I had been hollow with grief, my eyes sore from weeping, my hands wrinkled from clutching tissues. I thought the worst was over, that burying the man I loved was the hardest blow life could deal me. But I was wrong. We were in the living room, the one he had built with his own 2 hands back in the days when money was tight but love was abundant. My son and daughter sat across from me, their spouses at their sides, speaking in tones so rehearsed it was as though they had practiced them beforehand. "Mom," my daughter began, her voice all silk and pity, "you know how Dad left everything to us. He just wanted to make sure the house stayed in the family." I nodded, waiting for the part where they reassured me I'd always have my place in it. But that part never came. My son cleared his throat. "We've been talking, and well, it's not really practical for you to live here anymore. You're alone, Mom. It's too much for you. Too much for me." That was how he said it, as though I were a burden in the home I had kept running for 40 years. As though the meals I had cooked, the socks I had darned, the scraped knees I had bandaged were debts long forgotten. "You'll be fine," my daughter added quickly. "We're dividing the house. Greg's family will take the left side and we'll take the right. You can visit whenever you like." Visit? In my own home? The word struck me harder than any slap. I remember the room spinning, the air leaving my chest. I wanted to protest, to shout, to remind them that every inch of that home carried my fingerprints. But grief has a way of stealing your voice. My husband had trusted them blindly, never imagining they would exile me from the very home we built together. And so, with his coffin still fresh in the earth, they wrote me out of my life. I packed a small suitcase that night. Just the basics. A few dresses, a sweater, the quilt my mother had made me when I first married. I left behind furniture I had polished for decades, photo albums I had carefully arranged, Even the teacups my husband had surprised me with on our 25th anniversary. My children didn't help me pack. They didn't even walk me to the door. The night air was sharp as I stepped onto the porch, the house looming behind me like a stranger. I remember the weight of the suitcase handle digging into my palm, the sound of laughter coming from inside, my laughter no longer welcome. The house glowed warm with light, but for me there was only the dark street ahead. For weeks afterward, I wandered from one borrowed couch to another, too ashamed to tell friends what had happened. I told them I was staying with family for a while, though of course the truth was the opposite. I had been stripped of family altogether. I carried the bitter taste of being unwanted like a stone in my chest. Over time I made a life elsewhere. Modest, quiet, pieced together from what scraps were left. But the sting never faded. Every holiday, every birthday, I would sit alone and wonder how the children I had raised could discard me so easily. And now here they were again, their voices syrupy sweet over the phone, promising visits, hugs, laughter. As though none of that had ever happened. As though 20 years hadn't passed since they had locked me out of my own life. Standing in my brother's grand estate, surrounded by the wealth and legacy he had left to me, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and defiance. My husband had left everything to the children, believing they would take care of me. He died never knowing the cruelty they were capable of. My brother, on the other hand, he knew. That was why he left it all to me. The betrayal of the past and the inheritance of the present collided inside me like storm clouds. I could almost hear Thomas's voice. Be strong, sis. Protect what's yours. I pressed a hand against the cold marble wall and whispered to the empty house. Not this time. They will not take this from me. The wounds had reopened, yes. But this time, I was not the same woman who left her home in silence. This time I was ready to fight. It was a bright afternoon when I decided to wash the Rolls-Royce. I had been putting it off for days, too nervous to even touch it, afraid I might scratch the gleaming silver paint or break some piece of machinery I couldn't begin to understand. But that morning I woke with a kind of restlessness, the kind that makes you want to put your hands to work. So I tied back my hair, rolled up my sleeves, and carried a bucket of soapy water out to the garage. The car sat there like a sleeping beast, quiet, polished, waiting. My brother had adored this machine. I remember him once saying he didn't care if people forgot his name as long as they remembered the purr of that engine. It was his pride, his joy, the only thing he ever treated as if it were alive. I dipped the sponge into the suds and began wiping the hood. The California sun bounced off the chrome, almost blinding me. As I worked, I thought of Thomas sitting right there in the driver's seat, his hands firm on the wheel, his grin wide as he teased me about my old sedan. You drive that thing like you're apologizing to the road, he used to laugh. One day, sis, I'll teach you how to really drive. The sponge circled slowly, my arms remembering the motions of years of housework. It was comforting, almost like scrubbing the old kitchen floor or polishing silver before the holidays. And then when I finished the outside, I opened the door and slid inside. The leather smelled rich and worn, carrying the faintest trace of his cologne. For a moment I closed my eyes and let myself imagine he was still here. Then I reached toward the glove compartment. I don't know why. Maybe just curiosity. Maybe the simple instinct to explore the places he had left untouched. The latch clicked, and the little door swung open. Inside was a sealed envelope. My breath caught. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, with my name written in his strong, unmistakable hand, to my sister. My fingers trembled as I lifted it out. For a long moment I just stared, afraid to open it. Letters like that, they aren't written lightly. They are words meant to outlast the writer. I traced his handwriting with my fingertip, then slowly tore it open. The letter inside was brief, only a page. But oh, what weight it carried. He wrote that he knew me better than I thought. That he understood the pain I carried from the betrayal of my children. He had watched it all from a distance, powerless to step in, but never blind to it. And he wrote that he knew my children could not be trusted. Not with money, not with legacy, not even with love. That was why he left everything to me. You were the only one who never asked me for anything but my time, the letter read. You gave me your love freely, and I will not see you robbed of what is rightfully yours. They will come for you, I know it. They will smile and pretend, but remember this. I trusted you. Not them. Protect what I have given you. Be strong, sister. Stronger than you ever thought you could be. I pressed the letter against my chest, tears spilling before I could stop them. It was as though his hand had reached out from beyond the grave and steadied me, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. I read it again and again, each word carving itself into my heart. Thomas had known. He hadn't been fooled by the masks my children wore. He saw them clearly, and in his last act of love, he gave me the strength I needed to face them. For the first time since stepping into that house, I didn't feel like an imposter. This was not just his world, it was mine now because he wanted it to be. And I would not allow anyone to take it away. I tucked the letter back into the envelope and carried it to the study. There I placed it inside the top drawer of his desk, locking it carefully. Not out of fear of losing it, but because it was now my armor. Proof. A reminder I could hold on to when the storm came. And I knew the storm was coming. The phone call from my children had been the first rumble of thunder. Their syrupy voices, their sudden interest in visiting. But with Thomas's words pressed against my heart, I no longer felt afraid. I felt ready. That evening, I sat in the library with a cup of tea and spoke out loud to the silence. You were right, Thomas. They'll try to take it from me. But this time I will not bend. I will not be thrown out. This time I will stand. And for the first time in 20 years I believed it. The morning they arrived, the house felt different. I had dusted the front hall, polished the brass handles until they gleamed, even set out a tray with teacups in the parlor. Not because I wanted to impress them, heavens no, but because I wanted the house to look the way Thomas would have kept it. Proud, dignified, untouchable. I heard their voices before I saw them. The crunch of gravel as their cars rolled up the drive. The loud laughter that didn't quite sound real. I stood in the doorway, hands clasped tight in front of me, as my son stepped out first. He looked older than the boy I remembered. His hair thinning, his waist thicker, but his eyes still carried that sharp glint. Behind him came his wife, smiling as though she already owned the place. Then my daughter arrived, her arms wide, her voice pitched too high. Mom! She cried as though 20 years hadn't passed, as though she hadn't turned her back on me. She hugged me quickly, perfumed and brisk, already glancing past me into the foyer. Oh, Mom, this house! She exclaimed, her voice full of practiced wonder. It's magnificent. Uncle Thomas really knew how to live, didn't he? I stepped aside and let them in. Their footsteps echoed on the marble tile, their eyes darting from chandelier to staircase. My son ran his hand along the banister as though testing its weight, while his wife trailed behind, snapping photographs with her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. We gathered in the parlor. I poured tea, the cups rattling slightly as I set them down. My hands don't shake often, but that day they did. Not from weakness but from the storm inside me. I watched them sip politely, their eyes never resting on me for long. They roamed the room taking inventory. The rugs. The paintings. The furniture. Mom, my son said finally, clearing his throat. This is a lot of house for you. Don't you think it's too much? There it was. Not even an hour into their visit. I managed just fine, I said, my voice steady. Your uncle wanted me here. And here I'll stay. He chuckled as if I'd made a joke. Of course. We're just saying it must be overwhelming. Maybe we could help. Take some of the burden off your hands. My daughter leaned forward, her smile too sweet. Yes, Mom. We worry about you. You shouldn't have to handle all this alone. We could look after things for you. Look after. That was the phrase she used, as if I were a child handing over a toy. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the silence stretch. In that quiet I could almost hear Thomas whispering, "They'll circle you, sis. Don't let them close in." The conversation shifted then, though not really. They asked about my health, their questions sharp as needles hidden in velvet. Did I feel tired in the evenings? Did I ever get confused in a house so large? Did I remember to take my pills? Each word dressed as concern, but I knew better. I saw the glances they exchanged, the notes being taken silently behind their eyes. When the tea was finished, they asked for a tour. I agreed, though every step felt like leading wolves through a pasture. They admired the dining room, the library, the garden sprawling out in the back. My son whistled low at the sight of the wine cellar. My daughter trailed her fingers along the marble counters in the kitchen, as though she was already picturing her own gatherings there. And then we reached the garage. The moment they saw the Rolls-Royce, their faces changed. My son walked around it slowly, reverent, as though he were circling an altar. "Wow," he murmured. "This is something else. Did Uncle Thomas drive it often?" "All the time," I said softly. He placed his hand on the hood. "You don't really drive, do you, Mom? Maybe I should take it out for you. Keep it in shape." I stepped between him and the car, my back straighter than it had been in years. "No. This one stays with me." His eyebrows lifted, surprise flashing in his eyes. My daughter tried to smooth it over with a laugh, but I saw the irritation beneath her smile. They weren't used to me drawing lines. Not anymore. We ended the tour back in the parlor. They sat with their heads close, whispering, pretending to admire the chandelier. I pretended not to notice. But I could feel it. Their hunger, their plans forming even as the sun dipped lower through the tall windows. When they finally left that evening, the house fell back into silence. I stood in the foyer, watching their cars disappear down the long drive. For a moment I let myself sag against the doorframe, my body heavy with the weight of it all. But then I straightened. Because I knew now, without a doubt, what Thomas had warned me about. They hadn't come for me. They had come for the fortune. At first, they wore their concern like a costume, draping it over every word. My daughter phoned me the next morning, her voice bright as bells. "Did you sleep well, Mom? You know, sometimes older people don't rest as deeply in big houses. Too quiet, maybe too lonely. Wouldn't you feel safer if one of us stayed with you?" Her words were smooth, but I heard the question hidden beneath them. "Wouldn't you feel safer if we had a foot inside the door?" I thanked her kindly and said I slept just fine, though the truth was I'd lain awake half the night replaying every glance, every whisper from their visit. My son's wife staring too long at the paintings. My daughter running her hand along the kitchen counters. My son circling the Rolls-Royce like a wolf who'd caught the scent of fresh meat. The calls kept coming. Little questions always dipped in sugar. "Mom, do you keep track of your medicine? Maybe I should organize it for you. Do you handle all your bills yourself? That must be overwhelming. Have you thought about how hard it must be to maintain such a big estate? Maybe it's time to downsize." Downsize. That word again and again like a hammer striking the same spot. What they meant, of course, was give it up. Hand it over. I started noticing their visits were never just visits. They came armed with questions, their eyes darting to the papers on my desk, the mail stacked neatly in the kitchen, the safe tucked discreetly in the study. They asked about lawyers, doctors, even the neighbors. Who knew me? Who would notice if something happened? It dawned on me then, sitting one evening with Thomas's letter pressed to my chest, that they were not circling out of love. They were circling out of strategy. This wasn't about family. It was about conquest. One afternoon, while I trimmed roses in the garden, my daughter strolled out, pretending to admire the blooms. Mom, she said, plucking a petal between her fingers. Some people might say a house like this isn't safe for someone your age. All these stairs, all this upkeep. What if you had an accident? Her voice was light, almost playful, but I saw the shadow in her eyes. She wasn't worried about my bones. She was worried about my will. I smiled sweetly and handed her the pruning shears. Then I suppose I'd better be careful, dear. Would you mind finishing this bush for me? The look on her face told me she hadn't expected me to hand her the tools. She wanted me helpless. She wanted me weak. And I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. That night, as I locked the Rolls-Royce safely in the garage, I whispered to Thomas, "You were right. They're not here for me. They're here for it. All of it." Recognizing the trap didn't frighten me. It steadied me. I remembered the night 20 years ago when they threw me out. How I had left in silence, crushed beneath their betrayal. This time was different. I had evidence. I had my brother's letter, my lawyer's protections, my own hard-won wisdom. But still I felt the sting of it. To look into the eyes of the children I had raised, the children whose fevers I cooled with damp cloths, whose scraped knees I kissed, whose futures I once prayed for, and see only calculation staring back. It is a bitter thing to know your love has turned into their leverage. The days grew heavier with their presence. They visited often now, too often, never empty-handed. They brought flowers, cookies, books they thought I might enjoy. Each gift was another mask, another attempt to dress greed as affection. And always the questions about money. How much was in the bank? Who helped me manage it? Had I thought about setting up a trust? My son even laughed one evening as he poured himself a drink from the liquor cabinet. Mom, it's a lot of responsibility for someone your age. Wouldn't it be easier if we stepped in? Just to make things smoother? Smoother. That was his word. My children wanted to smooth me right out of the picture. That night, as I sat alone in the library, I felt the old wound ache again. The memory of standing on my porch with a suitcase 20 years younger but already broken. And I realized this was their pattern. When my husband died, they took everything. And now, with Thomas gone, they meant to do it again. But this time they had miscalculated. Because this time I saw the trap for what it was. And I was ready. The day they stopped pretending was the day I knew the real fight had begun. Up until then, my children had worn their masks well enough. Sweet smiles, gentle tones, little gifts wrapped in tissue paper. But masks can only be held so long before they slip, and theirs began to crack. Started with my son. He came by one afternoon, carrying a folder tucked under his arm. He sat across from me in the parlor, his knee bouncing restlessly, and cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking. You're alone here with all this responsibility. What if something happened to you? Who would take care of your affairs?" "I have already taken care of them," I replied. His eyes narrowed. "With who?" "My lawyer," I said calmly. "Everything is in order." That was when his smile tightened, thin and brittle. He set the folder on the coffee table and slid it toward me. I drew up some papers. Power of attorney. Just so we can step in and help if needed. All you'd have to do is sign. I looked at the papers, then at him. My boy. The one I had once carried on my hip through rain and fever. The one whose first steps I had clapped for in the kitchen. And now he was sitting across from me, asking me to hand him the keys to everything I had left. I pushed the folder back across the table. "No, thank you." His jaw tightened. "Mom, don't be stubborn. This is for your own good." I stood. My hands were trembling, but my voice was steady. I said no. That was the first crack. The second came soon after, when my daughter arrived with her husband. They brought dinner, takeout in paper bags, and set it on the counter like they were doing me a kindness. Halfway through the meal, her husband leaned back in his chair and said casually, "You know, Evelyn, these estates can be complicated. Property taxes alone must be brutal. Maybe it's time to think about selling. My daughter chimed in. You could move into a nice condo, Mom. Somewhere smaller, safer. We could handle the sale for you. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I laid my fork down and looked at them both. Your uncle wanted me here. I am not selling. Their faces flickered. First surprise, then frustration. They had expected me to crumble, to fold as I had 20 years ago. They didn't realize I was no longer the same woman. But the worst was yet to come. Soon little rumors began to reach me. A neighbor mentioned that my children had asked about my health, hinting that I was forgetful, confused. At the grocery store, a clerk asked gently if I needed help balancing my checkbook, something no one had ever asked before. Word was spreading, whispers planted by familiar tongues. And then came the letter, delivered by courier, crisp and official. A petition filed in court, questioning my capacity to manage my own affairs. My children had claimed I was no longer fit, that I was vulnerable, in need of guardianship. I sat in the study, the paper trembling in my hands, rage and heartbreak battling in my chest. My own flesh and blood had dragged me into a courtroom war. But I did not cry. Not this time. Instead, I opened the drawer of Thomas's desk and pulled out his letter. His words steadied me like a hand on my shoulder. Protect what I have given you. Be strong. So I called my lawyer. A sharp woman with steel in her eyes who had helped Thomas with his affairs. She came to the house, sat with me at the desk and said firmly, "We'll fight this. They won't take a penny from you." The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, hearings, and paperwork. My children tried every angle. They painted me as feeble, confused, incapable. They called in neighbors, old acquaintances, anyone who might testify that I seemed tired or forgetful. But I was ready. I had records, witnesses, friends who stood beside me. My pastor testified to my clarity of mind. My doctor confirmed I was in good health. And through it all, I sat tall in the courtroom, my back straight, my voice clear, never wavering. Each attempt they made crumbled under the weight of preparation. Each lie they spun unraveled in the face of truth. At night, I would sit in the library with a cup of tea, exhausted but unbroken. The house no longer felt like an empty palace. It felt like a fortress. A place where I was standing finally in my own strength. My children grew more desperate with each failure. Their smiles, once so syrupy, turned bitter. Their visits became shorter, their words sharper. They no longer bothered to hide their hunger. But I was not afraid. Not anymore. Because this time I wasn't walking away with a suitcase in shame. This time I was standing my ground. And no matter what tricks they pulled, I would not let them take what was mine. When the battles dragged on, there were nights I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the old house. Not from fear, but from the weight of memory. 20 years ago, when my children had cast me out, I had lain awake in borrowed beds, wondering what I'd done to deserve such cruelty. Back then I had been too broken to fight. This time I was different. I had prepared. Long before the first false smile crossed their faces, I had sat with lawyers, reviewed documents, signed protections. My brother had taught me, even from beyond the grave, that you don't wait for the wolves to appear. You build the fence before they circle. So when my children tried to claim I was incapable, my lawyers already had reports from doctors affirming my health. When they whispered to neighbors about my supposed confusion, I had friends ready to speak of my clarity and strength. When they filed petitions, we filed counterarguments twice as strong. The courtroom became a second battlefield. My son and daughter would arrive with their spouses, dressed in somber colors, wearing expressions of heavy concern. They spoke as though they were saints, burdened with the sad duty of protecting their poor, confused mother. They painted me as fragile, lost, in need of guardianship. And then I would take the stand. I sat tall, my back straight, my voice calm. I answered every question with precision. Every date and detail sharp in my mind. I looked directly at the judge, not a hint of wavering in my tone. And with each word I spoke, I could see my children's confidence crack just a little more. One morning after I testified flawlessly about managing the estate's finances, listing figures, dates, even the names of contractors I had hired, the judge leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, you seem more capable than most people half your age." I smiled politely and folded my hands in my lap. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my daughter's face tighten. Her lips pressed thin as sewing thread. Outside the courtroom, I found strength in the support of others. Friends who had known me since before my children turned cold. Neighbors who had seen me drive myself to the market, tend to the garden, pay bills on time. Even some of Thomas's old associates reached out, sending notes of encouragement, reminding me that my brother had trusted me above all others. Every piece of evidence, every voice in my corner, was a stone laid in the wall I was building between myself and their schemes. But strength is not only legal, it is emotional. And that was where the hardest battle lay. My children did not just use courts and lawyers. They used memory. One evening, my daughter sat across from me in the parlor, tears shining in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "don't you remember when I was little, and you used to braid my hair before school? Don't you remember how close we were?" Her voice cracked on those words, and for a moment my heart trembled. I did remember. I remembered brushing out her long hair, humming softly as the sun came through the kitchen window. I remembered her little hand in mine, warm and trusting. But then I remembered something else. The coldness in her eyes when she turned me out of my own home. The way she had stood beside her brother and nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world to exile their mother. I straightened. "Yes, I remember," I said. "And that is why this hurts more than you will ever understand. But memory does not excuse betrayal." She dropped the act then, her tears vanishing like smoke. Her face hardened, and I knew I had struck the truth. Standing strong meant more than resisting their legal battles. It meant resisting the pull of old wounds, the temptation to believe that the children I once loved might still come back to me. They would not. Not as they were now. And so, I armored myself with Thomas's letter. Some nights when exhaustion threatened to weigh me down, I would pull it from the drawer and read his words again. "Be strong, sister. Stronger than you ever thought you could be." Each time it felt as though he were sitting beside me, his hand steady on my shoulder, his voice reminding me that I was not alone. The lawsuits failed one by one. The petitions crumbled under the weight of truth. My children grew quieter, their visits less frequent, their false concerns slipping away to reveal only the hunger beneath. They had underestimated me. They thought I was still the woman they had once cast out, broken and voiceless. But I had become something else. I was strong. Stronger than I had ever thought possible. And with every battle I won, I felt the chains of that old betrayal loosen, replaced by something fierce and unyielding. I would not be robbed again. The day I threw them out was quiet, almost ordinary. The sun shone through the tall windows, the roses in the garden were in bloom, and the Rolls sat gleaming in the garage. Nothing grand or dramatic, no storm, no thunder. Just a simple morning when I finally decided enough was enough. They had come again, uninvited, their smiles tighter than ever. My son carried another folder of papers. My daughter brought her false tears. They sat in my parlor and spoke of concern and responsibility, circling the same words like vultures circling over prey. But I was no longer prey. "Stop," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I've listened long enough. You have come here not for me, but for what you think you can take from me. And I will not allow it." They froze, blinking at me as if I'd spoken in a language they no longer understood. My daughter stammered something about love, about family, but I raised my hand. "Love does not cast a mother out of her home," I said. "Family does not file lawsuits to strip her of dignity. You lost the right to those words a long time ago. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. And then, with a strength I didn't even know still lived in my bones, I stood and pointed to the door. Get out. Their faces twisted. Anger, disbelief, maybe even shame. But they gathered their papers, their coats, their pride, and left. The front door closed behind them with a finality that rang through the house like a bell. And then silence. But it was a different silence than before. Not the heavy, lonely hush that had pressed down on me in my first days here. This silence was clean, almost light, as though the walls themselves had sighed in relief. I went to the study and opened the drawer. Thomas's letter lay there, folded neatly, waiting. I held it to my chest and whispered, "It's done, brother. I kept it safe. Just like you asked." From that day on I chose peace. Not the peace of giving in or being quiet, but the peace of standing firm, of knowing that no one could take from me again what had been entrusted to my care. I tended the gardens myself, planting bright marigolds and roses in every shade I could find. I drove the Rolls on sunny afternoons, the engine purring beneath me like a loyal friend. Sometimes people would turn their heads as I passed, surprised to see an old woman behind the wheel of such a grand car. I'd smile and think, "Oh, Thomas, you'd be laughing now." I filled the rooms with my own touches. Quilts on the chairs, flowers in the vases, photographs of the few friends who had stood by me. The house no longer felt like a museum to a life I hadn't lived. Felt like mine. Do I still think of my children? Of course. A mother's heart never forgets, no matter how deep the wound. But I no longer ache for their approval. I no longer wait by the phone. They may carry my blood, but they do not carry my love. That is something they cast aside long ago. What I carry now is gratitude. Gratitude for my brother, who saw me clearly when others did not. Gratitude for the strength I didn't know I had, which grew only because I was forced to find it. Gratitude for peace, hard-won, stubborn, and mine at last. And when the evenings come, soft and golden, I sit in the garden with a cup of tea, the roses nodding in the breeze, and I think, for once I am not robbed of what's mine. For once I am free.